to join. There's a couple of introductions I'd like to make. First of all, thank you so much for coming.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, it's so I'm going to broadly introduce the meeting. Luke, are you there? So this is Luke Klein, is the president of the SDS, the Strategic and Diplomatic Society here at Concordia University, and they asked me to host a Wargame speaker series focusing on Taiwan, and we had spoken that you were very busy and you had already given a lot of thought to the conflict in Ukraine. So what I did was organize a series of talks with what I think are the leading wargame designers. And so if you permit me just a brief 5-minute intro. As an academic, I've been using wargaming for pedagogy for quite some time, and of course, Jim Dunnigan's wargame Sinai basically anticipated the 1973 October War, and Mark Herman's Gulf Strike was, anyone who possessed it opened it up when Saddam Hussein entered Kuwait in 1990. But what struck me personally was playing Anzio about 15 years ago with 2 students over 3 months, and the students were not aware of the precise schedule of the conflict. But I noticed that the game replicated perfectly. I mean, a 2.5-year conflict, the students were compelled by the design to follow through almost exactly what actually occurred week by week in the war. And it struck me that when Target came to Canada, they made $1 billion mistake and left. When NATO pursued their campaign in Afghanistan, it cost almost $900 billion. And yet here's this $25 game on eBay that can simulate reality with just a map and cardboard, and that there are people that have mastered the ability to take the sociological complexity of diplomacy and warfare and abstract it into something manipulable that becomes useful in public policy. And it's something which is underexplored. And of course, Mr. Chadwick, you've been designing games since the 1970s, and you sent us your biography, which has been sent out to all of our viewers right now, and so they can read it. But I'd like to emphasize my experience. Mr. Chadwick, you have what I would describe as a full spectrum appreciation for the sociology of warfare. I was an Army engineer, and of course I was heavily influenced, even before joining the Army Engineers, by your assault series, particularly the engineering and the philosophy that went into emulating the doctrinal differences between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, to the extent that with the current war in Ukraine, rerunning the assault series, we can see a stark contrast between the Soviets and the Russians, and the fact that it told us so much about what the Russians were not doing that they should have with the design of their equipment. And then I'm sure you can see some of the simulations that you designed behind me. I had a 3-month simulation at the next level up, your design of Suez-73, which is frankly, it should be the companion to Dupuy's Elusive Victory, the history of the Middle East, where popular journalistic interpretations of the Middle East are that Israeli technological superiority is important, or huge cultural differences. Trevor Dupuy found something like a 200 to 300% difference in intangible combat performance. Your Suez-73 identifies the actual organizational differences between the two sides, so that the actual cultural difference between the Israeli and Egyptian soldiers was 20%. You are able to account for organizational differences that explain the outcome. And it's one thing to read a paragraph in a book about the Israelis are better trained, they have more experience, they have more rational decision making. It's another one to have a simulation that reproduces the conflict consistently and reliably. It creates valid outcomes. And then you have I think you re-released your strategic simulation, the Third World War, which again, I ran here with a team of students. And I mean, I should emphasize it was not just the Central Front. It went from the Arctic Circle of Norway all the way to the border of Pakistan. You had in there a diplomatic precursor game that had no equilibrium. You have to use a mathematical a mixed game strategy to find the equilibrium, and even then it had so many variables. You had to use linear algebra to solve it, and it basically brought to the forefront the whole political context within which warfare occurs, and why you fight. What the political setup is. So. Mr. Chadwick, I mean, it's a great pleasure to have you here. And essentially, I would like you to share with us in whichever way you'd like, what advice you could give my students in the realm of simulation design from your half century of full spectrum experience.
Well, actually, it won't be a half century until next year, I guess, but close enough, huh? Well, thanks very much for inviting me to begin with, to be here. I'm delighted, and Luke, it's very nice to meet you. I guess what I would like, what I would say is, I'd start, if I want to talk about simulations, I would start with a definition. Which is a little different than I think a lot of people would make. To me, a simulation is a detailed argument by the designer as to the cause of an outcome. And that's why most of them are historical. Now, they can be speculative about future things, but it grows from looking at A happened and then B happened, and the simulation is about why A produced B and how it produced it, and I don't see it so much as this kind of magic box that you put inputs in and then stuff magically comes out. I mean, I think it is the outcome of the designer deliberately, designer coming to a conclusion as to what was going on. And then the simulation duplicates that and forms the argument for what caused it. Because ideally, if you do the same inputs as the original players did, you will get the same outputs. And you'll see the process by which that happens. But then along the way, it also says, if you push this button differently, this is what happens. And the reason that it happens that way has to do with what the designer believes is the cause driving it. Certain things you can say come out in the wash, but I mean, the actual core mechanics of the game are really designed at explaining. And I have a lot more faith in the heuristic ability of games than I have in their predictive ability. I have a lot of faith in the predictive ability of really good game designers because they become immersed in the subject, and designing a game, a simulation, forces you to organize your thinking along causal lines and think through the causality of events very carefully and be able to defend it. And so you can come out of that with a better understanding of a possible future outcome of a conflict. But I don't know that the mechanics of the game itself have a magic predictive ability. And we've got too many examples of wonderful simulations that just went terribly wrong in terms of their predictive ability. The Louisiana maneuvers that proved, back in the pre-World War II, before our entry into World War II, that proved categorically that tank destroyers will just eat up tanks every time, and there's not much the tanks can do about it. And, that's because that's the argument that the designer of the rules for those maneuvers made, and had already come to that conclusion, and the simulation illustrates it. It didn't prove it. So I think that in most cases, the real value of the simulation is in showing the thinking of the designer about causation, and illustrating it and making that argument. And if it's not a good argument, it's not going to fly. But hopefully. So when we talked about Suez 73, I mean, I like Suez. It's a little bit, I think I'd find a little less, a little bit more mechanically streamlined way of doing it if I were doing it today. But the core argument in the game as to how that combat worked, particularly, well, ideally, mostly right around Chinese farm. I mean, it covers a lot, but it's really meant to be a real board down examination of what happened at Chinese farm. And I think I'm happy with it as well. I'm glad you're happy with it. I think it is a pretty good argument as to what the mechanics of that battle were like. But it's a lot easier to do that after the battle than it is to try to do it before the battle and figure out what's going to happen.
You know, when we were playing it, and we did it with the goal of trying to discover your underlying philosophy, which meant every time we made a rule error, we went back and replayed the turn. But the hypothesis test we approached it with was Kenneth Pollock's MIT dissertation on Arab culture and combat performance. And it's just this enormous 700-page dissertation with sort of an exhaustive list of every battle. And he looked at indicators that came up in your simulation. But you know, it's one thing to read an accumulation of I guess synopses of battles, and another to play it, and then sort of you have repetition in your simulation. You know, my question is, how did you come to that realization? It's very easy for an academic to write an account of something, identify variables, and you know, you have John Stuart Mill's method of difference to try to isolate the effects. You created something dynamic that stayed on the road for, I mean, many, you know, the iteration, of course, is many turns, but also many games.
How do you do that? I guess you have, well, you'll get a chance to talk to some of the, your speaker list is terrific, by the way. The other people you got lined up, I think will have some good things to say about all these issues. But I think you have to have the sort of mind that wonders how things work. Not just what happened, but why, how, what was going on that drove that. That would be one thing I would say. But the other thing I would say is that it helps to do it for a long time. Because I'm not a big fan of Aristotle, but I think he got one thing absolutely right, and that was the notion that we are what we habitually do. And modern brain plasticity research kind of reinforces that. If you use your brain a certain way for over and over and over for a long, long time, it gets used to doing that. I mean, it begins thinking in those terms. And so you really do, over time and repetition, train yourself to look for why something is happening and what the mechanic was that made it. I guess in the same way that that engineers do that with mechanical devices. I know my father was an engineer, and he was a terrific mechanical aptitude. And years ago, in the early days at Game Designers Workshop, we had one of the first IBM Selectronic, it's kind of a combination typewriter and typesetter, one of the first ones of those. And he was visiting, and the art director was cleaning the platen, and he couldn't get it back in. And my dad just kind of walked over and says, "Let me look at that." And he just pushed one little thing, click, in this hedge of gears, and it slipped right in. And he'd never seen the machine before. And Rich said, "Well, how did you know that?" And he says, well, it just, the way all those gears were, that piece looked like it was in the wrong place. You know, it was just the habit of his, the mental habit of how he looked at things in the world. So beyond that, I'm not sure I can tell you how to go about that, but it does help to just do it a lot and keep doing it.
You designed Suisse 73, I think, I mean, early in your career, meaning within the first decade and a half. And of course, you have your OOB research pamphlet, or rather monograph, is bigger than your rule book. So obviously, you did a lot of research, but so many people get the dynamic model wrong, even with the same facts.
Mhm.
So somehow, what really drove it home was I had a student who played another simulation, and his father was a tow truck driver from India who immigrated to Israel during the '73 war. That's a huge component of your simulation, which is something that very few simulations model, which is the recovery process, the mechanics who fix things, drive around the battlefield at night collecting things. You obviously identified that as key. I mean, we see that, of course, in Ukraine today. So, I mean, just picking on one decisive variable, how did you zoom in on that? Huge force multiplier.
I think part of it was the actual getting down in the weeds with what was happening with Israeli tank battalions. And there's some things I didn't go into there that I understood even a little better later, was how an Israeli tank battalion worked. And the way it worked was you had a lieutenant colonel commanding it, and he had some tanks, and that's pretty much it. So if you had 6 tanks left and you had the lieutenant colonel there, you still had a tank battalion. If you had 12 tanks, but the colonel got killed and there wasn't someone in a position to step up into that slot, you got folded into another battalion. And it was really interesting the way that the more you looked at that, you realized that these were forces built around a leader, and then they just keep repairing tanks and putting crews in there and giving them to them, pushing them into that guy's unit. So the need to not just repair tanks, but also reassemble tank crews and get them functional as that crew unit, and then give them to a commander who knew what to do with them, was really critical to the Israelis staying in that fight. And if you can't do that, your units just melt away pretty quickly. It's interesting. I was a number of years later. It was right after the Gulf War. I was at the armor conference that year at Fort Knox, and there were a whole bunch of the returning division commanders who were giving presentations there, including then Major General Funk, who commanded 3rd Armored Division. And one of the things he mentioned was that they were just beating the Iraqis, like a drum, of course, because we had the best equipment out there. Our thermals saw through the smoke. I mean, we had everything going for us. We were a terrifically trained force, and we'd sat there for a month with no turbulence in the unit, training in place. So when they went, I mean, those guys were really cocked and loaded, and off they went. But he said what struck him was that they were running up against Republican Guard battalions. They would ruin the battalion, and then 2 days later, it would be back there fighting them at about half strength. But that although their combat ability was technically and tactically was nowhere near ours, there were some people there who really understood force reconstitution and cohesion, and were putting those units back together again pretty quickly, which was not something I expected. I don't think any of us expected that, that you'd find this little gem of competence in that army, but it appears to have been there. So I think force reconstitution, and so and in the Russo-Ukrainian War, boy, the ability to reconstitute forces is really important, given the equipment losses and the manpower losses both sides have sustained. I'll tell you something else that I'll tell you. This is very closely related to that. But when you talked about Third World War, and the thing I think I'm proudest of in Third World War is the air system. And it's not the air combat system; it's the air sustainment system. And it was really the '73 war that woke me up to how important sortie rate was. I mean, just sortie rate was the absolute force multiplier for the Israeli Air Force in '73. And you could look at how many planes people have, but I mean, if they're flying them every once a day and you're flying yours 3 times a day, you're putting a lot more ordnance on the target. And so Third World War, that's when I went back and started looking at the balance of forces in Europe, as particularly the air forces at that point, and said, everybody says this is going to be one-sided, and I think they're right, but maybe not the way they think. When you look at what our operational sortie rate was, and what we were pretty sure the Soviet ability to sortie aircraft was, and theirs wasn't very good. So I think mechanically, that's the thing I think I'm proudest of in Third World War is that system that ties effectiveness to sortie rate.
But that system, if I recall, that was used for the Next War series, Next War Korea in 1995, and then it was used again for this most recent Next War series, the Next War Vietnam. Okay. Were you the first? Because that system has been replicated in the most popular simulations now, rather than having to sort of go through the nitty gritty of each sortie. It's the go-to aggregation system for resolving air.
Well, basically it's not you fly, then you're down, and then you've got to come back up, and what's the percentage chance that each aircraft comes back up? Well, I'm the first I knew of. I'm the first I can remember, but that was a long time ago. So I don't want to slight anybody else, but I was not aware of any system that did it when I did it. I was not taking it from anything else that I played. And I don't know that I played the Next War series. Actually, that sounds strange, but I don't know that I did. But to the best of my recollection, that was the first one. And I had a friend who at that time was at Maxwell Air Force Base at the area. He was not he was a serving officer, but at the Air University. And he said that when they pulled out Third World War, a lot of people said, "Huh." So it was. I don't think it was. I don't think it was widespread anyway.
Oh, you mean appreciation of the system?
Yes, that particularly the emphasis on sortie rate and serviceability, as opposed to just this is the combat factor. Yeah, the emphasis on serviceability and how important that ended up being, so that the first turn or two, the NATO's really got their hands full, but the Soviets had a turn or two with that Air Force, and then it just wasn't flying anymore, and it didn't. Quite aside from losses, just from you fly it and they just can't get it right back up in the air again.
Yeah, we did, of course, play at Concordia, and with a very large team. I think it was the largest single team play we did, and we managed to get in quite a few turns because the system is quite streamlined. And of course, we had the I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but there's a map that was made that connect the two maps together. That includes Egypt, Israel, Syria, Jordan, which we used. So we were able. There's sort of enough geographic contiguity that the NATO player could move their aircraft around, and the Soviet player could move their aircraft and focus on a particular front. Sorry, I'd like to remind the people that have joined us that you can ask a question. So if anyone would like to ask a question, just raise your hand. Mr. Chadwick, if I could ask some other sort of generalized questions. Of course, I remember Twilight 2000. And so I have sort of the general question about what your position is on SLA Marshall, right? Because if you're going to build up a bigger system, you have to start with the individual soldier, and of course he made claims, and I know the warning that squad leader isn't necessarily a good simulation, right? It may be more of a game.
It's a good game. The original squad leader is a really good game. It's
but it's I still don't know. I still don't know what dispersed, shaken, broken looks like. I know Trevor Dupuy wrote a book called Understanding Defeat, where they interviewed soldiers that ran away. So I have, frankly, an anecdotal interpretation but really, my interpretation, or rather my understanding is informed by Hollywood. What is your understanding at that individual level, the very building block? How do people behave? What does victory look like? What does running away look like?
Oh, boy, that's a big question. If you start off by saying, what do I think of S.L.A. Marshall? I mean, I think he was someone who saw a fair amount of combat, and I think he had some thinking about it that wasn't terribly wrong. Wasn't terribly wrong-headed. He may have exaggerated, and I think his main sin was that he, in order to convince people he was right, he kind of fudged the numbers and made it sound like there was a lot of empirical stuff behind this, and there really wasn't. That would be that's that Marshall played fast and loose with the data, but I think there was something to what he was saying. The low number of people who actually shoot their weapons. Now, when you're in a war that is primarily a small arms war, like for example Vietnam, a lot of people shot their weapons, and everybody had automatic weapons, and it's a lot easier to get people to shoot an automatic weapon because they think they're doing something. A single shot rifle, people are reluctant to shoot it if they don't actually have a target. Whereas an automatic weapon, they'll kind of spray in an area. I've read a number of memoirs, a surprising number of memoirs of combat soldiers, combat infantrymen. I remember I was reading one about a fellow in the 82nd Division, I think, in World War II, and he fought all from the Siegfried Line all the way through to the end, and he was in a rifle company, and he never shot his rifle ever, and he never had a target. And I mean, they were in some pretty good combat, but it was always over. Whenever he'd be going through the woods and he'd hear shooting, and he'd get there and there was nothing going on now. And and then he gets shot at a lot by artillery, and so there's a lot of times when he was there were a bunch of German tanks and infantry around, and he was in a foxhole, and he thought if he shot at them, they'll just come shoot him. It's tanks. So there's all sorts of reasons why people don't actually pull the trigger. Now, the ones that do appear to pull it a lot. What's actually going? The question of what's actually going on there is a good one, and I think it's a lot different for a lot of different people. One of the things I think we know now is we know this actually even in armored warfare. Let's not even getting beyond infantry, is that in tank platoons in combat, it's usually one tank that does almost all the killing. And as long as that tank's around, that platoon's pretty effective. And if that tank gets knocked out, all of a sudden it's not doing anything. We know a lot of times and this is from the 73 war from Israeli accounts, a lot of times anybody in the tank gets wounded, and the tank pulls back. And there was always Israeli tanks coming back from the line, and there's officers stopping them and sending them back in, and getting the wounded out. But if you take a casualty in a unit and somebody it's not that easy to just keep going like in the movies. I mean, it's a emotionally shattering event, and people respond differently to it. So
you must be familiar with there's a statistic in a book called ACE where, I mean, it's fairly robust across different wars, that 5% of the pilots do 40% of the shooting down. And so and some of the profiles of these pilots, like Gabe Gabreski, I think, who's America's ace of the Second World War, he basically couldn't fly an airplane. He couldn't land an airplane, so he couldn't get a civilian job after the war. And it took him 4 years to after damaging a lot of airplanes before he could actually perform. But it makes me think, when we're looking at a basketball game or a hockey game, it's hard to identify those who are not doing the shooting but are doing the supporting, doing the suppressing. doing the leading. So this individual is not shooting. I mean, sociologically, it's difficult to say they didn't contribute. I mean, that's why the philosophy of what is it that these 10 people do? One person's shooting. What do the other people do? I'm wondering if we start removing these people who don't look like they're contributing, then suddenly that person who's doing all the shooting is not going to be able to. The fact that Gabe Gabreski turned into an ace meant that if the pilot selection process required you to master the skills within 24 months, the US would have no aces because the leading ace would have been excluded. So it is a peculiar, I of course for hockey it's it's $1 million business. I think they probably have figured out how to identify the person that does the assist to the goal. But having in the Canadian Reserves done training, I certainly had no clue how to select people. We just marched up and down the parade square and went to the range.
Well, in the NFL, which is a multi-billion-dollar business, and people have been spent. You have scouts that scout the top college football teams, and there's an enormous amount of resources put into that. But it's not a very great predictor as who's going to be a great player. I mean, the people that come out a lot on top in the draft, a lot of times the people that end up being the great players are second, third, fourth round draft picks, not first round. So there's an art to that, and I don't think we've been able to reduce it to science in terms of figuring that out.
May I ask?
I see Charles Camps has joined us. Hello, Chuck.
Hello. How you doing?
Pretty good. Pretty good.
Yeah, my apologies, Mr. Camps, Professor Camps. I had an issue with the Zoom link, so thank you for coming. So I have a question on this, the CRT. I mean, the 3-to-1 rule. I mean, I think again, I think Dupuy attributed it to a letter from General Grant to Lincoln to explain what was going on the battlefield. How when you I mean I guess the sort of the conventional wisdom is that this is the minimum you need to be able to advance onto a position, but how do you fashion? I mean, how do you determine how bloody a CRT is? How do you tailor it to the particular simulation that you're working on? I mean, it's one of the big mysteries because it's probably the most important mechanic.
It's mostly trial and error. I mean, I think the classic 3-to-1 CRT is pretty much gone by the wayside. You've still got the 3-to-1 odds column, but I think you've got I remember somebody talking about, maybe it was Basil Little Hart playing an Avalon Hill game, and the first thing he said was that, well, he amassed a force that would have been unstoppable on the battlefield 3-to-1, and he didn't, he had kind of mediocre results, and then he kind of lost interest and wandered away or something. But yeah, I mean, 3-to-1 on the battlefield, good heavens. If you've actually got 3-to-1 at the point of contact, that's pretty good. Of course, what we're saying is not necessarily, what a game says is not necessarily 3-to-1 in manpower, it's 3-to-1 in combat power. And that can be closer to, 1-to-1 in manpower, but with but with all the right stuff going into that, then it can get you up to a level that's overwhelming. In terms of how you do a CRT, I think in my experience, it's done empirically. That is to say, you write stuff down, and if it doesn't work, you change it. You have some sort of idea what you want to accomplish with the CRT. Because you have some idea of how you want the mechanics to work and what you want those combat values to mean, and what sort of results you want to produce, and then you start writing stuff on a table and play testing it, and then you say that didn't work, and you change it. So that's I think the process. I don't know that I can think that anybody's really gotten that down to a science as to plugging all this in and then out comes your CRT. Well, that'd be great, but I haven't experienced that myself. No,
I mean, there have been academic attempts to test the Lanchester equations, but inevitably either there's no data or it gets crowded out by a rain. or by the forest or by other variables. And so I mean, it's one among many. So it's so hard to actually perceive that phenomenon. It's deductively sound. It makes sense. You can certainly work it out with simple toy soldiers, but it just doesn't show up in any every statistical study I've ever seen that's done it has never been able to find significance. So we can't validate it.
Right. I think what I would come back to is kind of what I started off with, my definition of a simulation, and that is that it's the designer's argument as to causation, and I don't know that I believe in a universal predictor of stuff, but when you look at a particular situation, a designer is trying to replicate it, but it's trying to do it in a way that shows why the designer believes this outcome came from this input. If you do that, then as the designer, you're happy. You've got what you wanted. And in terms of its universal application, I'm not as interested in that. I'm interested in looking at a particular situation and making an argument about what went on.
Well, I think to some degree you can look at historical data and do that. That's what Livermore did when he looked at the original German Kriegspiel, and then he took data from American Civil War battles and retrofitted that into the German system to come out with what he believed would be a more accurate depiction of casualties.
But I would argue that even that was an argument.
Yes.
It was his argument as to what variables produced the casualties, and this is what made sense to him. And that's fine. That's fine.
It's all designer's art.
It is. Now you want to. Now every time you go into a game, you don't want to start by reinventing the wheel. You always go into it with some residue of conclusions about what you did the last time, and you look at what other people do too. But I still think that for the most part, every situation you look at you have to look at with a certain amount of fresh eye, or you're going to miss something. You're going to think that this is just like that, and it's hardly ever just like that.
No, especially when you're dealing with modern games, when you can look at proving ground capabilities of weapons, but then the whole thing is the soft factors that have to come in. The doctrine, the training, the ability of the officers and the NCOs and things like that, without which the Arabs would have won every Arab-Israeli war. And that's the part where you really have to work your brain to try and get those factors to go in there in something that's fairly reasonable.
And I also think that there are certain things that are really important in one situation because they break, and in another situation, it doesn't break for. And I will talk about logistics briefly. In the war in the Ukraine, you're not going to be able to do anything with that if you don't really have a very, very thoughtful treatment of logistics. And I mean logistics at every level: strategic logistics, operational, and tactical. All of those things, because in almost every one of those cases, the Russian logistics broke. Now, if you've got a situation where when we did Third World War, we didn't anticipate either side's logistics were going to break. So we've got a pretty simple supply rule, enough to keep people honest and not doing really crazy stuff. But that's the purpose of the logistics rule in that game. But if you're going to do the Ukraine, there's all sorts of stuff going in there that are really important to look at in terms of logistics. In a way, the first Gulf War was as well, in that Not in that the logistics broke, but you wouldn't have been able to go any further. I mean, the last day of the Gulf War, everybody had been like 4 days without sleep. They were on their last tank of gas. The artillery batteries had drained all the gas out of everything except their howitzers, and they had one load of ammo in it, and that was it. So at the end, if they didn't get it done that day, and everybody knew it was going to be done that day, there was going to have to be a big operational pause, but there was no operational pause during it. It was all one operational bound. So if you wanted to do something longer, you'd have to have a completely different treatment of logistics in that situation.
Yeah, offensive culmination.
Yeah,
that's the problem.
And of course, the Russians thought going into Ukraine, this is a one bound, operation. We're just going to do one bound. We don't have to worry about this stuff. We're going to do one bound. They're going to collapse. They're all going to, throw their guns away, and that's going to be it. Well, what's Plan B? Oh, it turns out there isn't a Plan B. So.
Well, they had one person convinced, that was General Milley.
Well, most people in the West are used to seeing a collapse of an untried army. And so I think, and particularly coming off of Afghanistan, nobody was willing to say, oh yeah, they're going to fight like tigers. So I think that had a lot to do with the fact that most people in the West did not think, that the Ukrainians were going to fight like that. And if we want to talk about this just for a moment, I think that's an aspect of simulation design that was what makes doing strategic games so devilishly complicated, and that's what are the victory conditions? Because in a strategic conflict, the toughest part of strategy is answering that question. What are the victory conditions? What does it take to put this guy on the map? If you know that, well, okay, that's fine. And in most games, you get told that. You just look in the rules book, here's the victory conditions. But when Russia invaded the Ukraine, they were going off of their experience of 2014, which was that the Ukrainian army pretty much melted away in front of them. Now, it was because the Ukrainian army was not psychologically prepared to shoot at Russians and fellow Ukrainian separatists. So from 2014 to 2022, the Ukrainian army put all their efforts into making sure that that wouldn't happen again. And the Russians said, well, we know the Ukrainians aren't going to fight. I mean, it was two completely different conclusions from the same data. But when the Russians went in, they thought they knew the victory conditions, and they were completely wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But may I ask, from the point of view of game design, I think Fred Charles Ickley wrote a book, Every War Must End. Obviously, there's sort of a dynamic where you have a convergence of policy goals after you suffer. And there's Heinz Goldman's, I think he just wrote an article in New Yorker based on his book of several wars, where he showed how over time the two sides will converge. And if there's a delay in convergence, it's because someone like Putin is afraid of punishment if he loses. And so he's gambling for resurrection. Normally, the victory conditions are static. How would you design a simulation where the victory conditions respond to how well or badly you're doing?
Well, part of the way I would do it is you have to make some notion that that the initial Russian idea might not have been completely crazy. That there might have been a trigger point that would have caused a collapse in Ukrainian resistance. Like, we don't know what would have happened if Zelensky actually would have fallen victim to one of the assassination attempts. Not that that would have ended it, but it would have had a component in the Ukrainian willingness to fight, because he was certainly he certainly had a lot to do with making the Ukrainian with stiffening Ukrainian resistance. Not that they wouldn't have fought without him, but I mean, that's just one more component. What would have happened if they had gotten into Kyiv? What would have happened if the most combat-ready brigade in the Ukrainian army, the 4th Rapid Reaction Force Brigade, hadn't been sitting right on the airfield where the where the Russians made their airborne coup, to take that airfield and then go overland. And their airborne spearhead was broken at that point, and then the follow-on troops got ambushed and nailed, and the wheels came off of everything in that offensive. So there are some what ifs there that I would say you've got a certain point within a very narrow time band where if you climb this hill, there's a good chance things. But if you don't get it done, then things change into a completely different set of victory conditions. And that, at least from a game point of view, would motivate that gamble to see if you can get the quick win. But if you can't get the quick win, it's a difference. It becomes a completely different situation. So that's how I go about it.
I have a question from Nicholas. Nicholas, can you make yourself visible? Oh yeah, we can't hear you, Nicholas. Yeah, it's one of my students, and I guess he needs to get his microphone working. So Nicholas, hang in there. Sorry, in the interim, until Nicholas gets his microphone working, may I ask you questions about? And again, it's a mechanical issue. We'll get into more detail with Ukraine after the break. But zones of control. Basically, it's the range of weapons that can interfere with movement. It's patrolling as well. And again, I don't know that much about military sociology. Again, I enjoy playing the games. I haven't done that much research on it. Clearly, there's a cultural component. Some cultures like to patrol, and others are risk averse and don't want to patrol. From my limited understanding of Canada's participation in Afghanistan and Kandahar, at night they locked down. They did not have standing patrols conducting ambushes at night. They were risk averse. They would drive into their compound. I'm wondering if when you assign a zone of control, what are you thinking about the dynamic that's going on? It's a very, very simple mechanic. It's very common, but I'm just very curious as to, because it's a fundamental component of some games. But Professor Camps, for example, he doesn't have it in his Korea 95 game. So clearly, there are some stark choices that are being made about a fundamental mechanic.
Yeah, and I've done some games without it. I think that when I do it without a zone of control, it's either because the unit itself is not filling the cell. The unit itself, its patrolling area or its zone of influence is the cell it's in. And that's usually because you have a very low troop density to the ground scale. What I think of is patrolling possibly. There are times when it's also the units are big enough that if you don't have units shoulder to shoulder in the cells, they will physically spread out and cover more ground. There's in some places it is actually people holding an extended front.
Yeah, no, I've had the experience of trying to get people to do a patrol and them refusing. not one of the top points of my leadership. Which it's obviously in the forest at 2 a.m. We're dealing with some very tired people, and I basically said no.
Well, I think when we say culture, I'm not a big believer in national characteristics. But I am, but there's a military culture is separate, and I think it is it's my belief. It's in my experience. I haven't seen a lot to counter this. That between leadership and training, and to a certain extent a sense of culture in the organization. But leadership and training accounts for almost all of performance. This notion that like the Italians weren't good soldiers and the Germans were, and you look at when the Italian units were well led and well trained, they performed fine. When Soviet units in World War II were well led and well trained, they performed fine. And the U.S. Army had the best division training program in history in World War II. And we just were, we were mass producing divisions, and they would hit the ground running, and they were great. Everybody talks about a couple failures, but for the most part, U.S. divisions in World War II in the ETO just were amazingly good. And I mean, there's this great example in the Vosges Mountains in the southern France, where the 100th Division goes into the line, and there's 2 German Volksgrenadier divisions that are dug in behind in high ground, and the weather's shitty, so there's no air support, and the logistics are bad, so there's not a lot of artillery support. And the 100th Division just goes through these guys. And von Mellenthin, who was the Army Chief of Staff down there in the South, wrote about this, and he said, well, you couldn't expect, German, Volksgrenadiers to stand up against, elite shock, units. And that was the combat baptism of the 100th Division. They were green as grass, but their training and the leadership was so good. They just performed spectacularly. And that was true of a lot of divisions. So I think, if you train people and if you lead them well, they're going to be good soldiers. And I don't, and that's kind of, to me, almost the beginning and end of it.
Yeah, no, it definitely comes out in your game design on Suez 73. I mean, it was frankly a surprising. There's a sociology journal, Armed Forces and Society, and they're constantly taking swipes at some war game designers because of this sort of intangible, explanation for cultural characteristics that they claim explains a lot. But there is a business sociologist called Geert Hofstede in Holland who's been doing statistical work for about 40 years. And what he does is survey IBM employees over time and between different countries. And so he argues there are cultural differences. Now, even if there are, of course, there's a question of magnitude. One of the big counterexamples that agrees with you is, of course, the Americans training the 50,000 Chinese that retreated into India in the Second World War, and with an American diet and American equipment and American training and American, giving of responsibility for initiative, suddenly you had a very efficient unit. And of course, they were politically dangerous, and Chiang Kai-shek had to get them destroyed in Manchuria at the beginning of the Civil War, lest they interfere with his politics. But I mean, that's a big debate. That's what I found so interesting in your Suez 73 design is you were able to account organizationally for the differences in between Arab and the Egyptian and the Israeli performance, which I thought was very important.
One of the things the Egyptians did that was very, very interesting, I think, was that up until the 73 war, up through the 67 war, there'd been this big cultural gulf between officers and enlisted men. There's certainly some stratification in Egyptian society. And there was a middle class that was mostly not involved in the military. But after 67, they began drafting middle class and, college bound or people, and they were, and they became, all of a sudden they developed a really good NCO corps, which they'd never really had before. And it made a difference. It made a real difference in unit cohesion for the Egyptians.
I was wondering if I could offer a hypothesis that you could comment on. There was a political sociologist who looked at Italy in the 1950s, a lot of survey work, and it basically focused on individuals giving allegiance to the state versus the family. And of course, you give allegiance to the family when that's where you need to get your job. When I visited Egypt, I interviewed a couple of Egyptian soldiers. My general impression was they would never choose Egypt as a state or a society over their immediate family. And their description of their service in the Egyptian army as conscripts was basically suffering. They weren't fed. Their families had to smuggle food to them. And then you compare it with, say, Israel and Hezbollah. In Israel and Hezbollah, you have a dental plan. So if the soldier is killed, the family's taken care of by the respective social networks. Egypt has no such social network. If you're born with your family, And they expect when you become an adult and you marry that as a male that you would then take care of your parents and your in-laws. And so there's this dependency network that is constantly pulling at what you're going to sacrifice for. And the solution should have been some sort of regimental system where your family is the regiment. I'm not sure, and of course that's organizational, but you could describe that as cultural to some extent. I mean, the Israelis they have a mobile labor force, and I'm just anecdotally, Golda Meir, from my understanding from her biography, she sacrificed her family for her political career. So she chose Israel over her family, and I believe there's some estrangement with her child. In Egypt, every soldier told me they would never sacrifice their family for the Egyptian state. So it's a sort of a different I guess appreciation for identity. So how would you diagnose that dynamic?
Well, I suppose I would diagnose it as a failure of training at that point, or instilling a strong culture of the unit, because there are certainly traditional societies that don't have a lot of that have very strong family links and not a lot of strong national links that nevertheless produce some very cohesive units. And Jordan comes to mind. Jordan's produced some very cohesive military units. Now, partly that was because however they managed to do it, the Bedouin recruits had a stronger sense of loyalty to the crown, but also I think there was just something in terms of how they built that sense of unit loyalty, and in a well set up unit, the unit kind of becomes a family. It becomes something of a family unit.
Glub Pasha.
Yeah, that?
Yeah,
Glub Pasha. Yeah. Well, that's he had a lot to do with shaping the Jordanian army. That's true.
In a lot of these third world countries that had antecedents that were British colonialism, the army's the only thing that works because that regimental tradition and training has passed on from the colonial rulers to the new government. So you do get a little bit of crossover there.
I had speculated that it was the freedom that you get with a tribal society, especially you have a consultation process in the Hashemites that sort of looks like primitive democracy, and people that are free are more likely to give their allegiance to something, as opposed to being an individual in an urban area in a large state where they're not consulted. You have an authoritarian government. Sorry, I was wondering, Nick, we have a question from Nicholas.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me now? It's
working? Yeah, perfectly.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to go back, sort of related to the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, something that was said earlier about how nobody expected the Ukrainians to fight the way that they're fighting. And so my question is, in wargaming, how can you account for this sort of rally around the flag moment where you have a state that's fighting better than it should, and that it's not due to training or anything like that? So how can you account for something like that in terms of wargaming?
Well, let me just start by saying that I'm not sure that in retrospect, it was easy for us to see that the Ukrainian army was going to fight, because there really were all these indicators. It was just nobody was willing to step up and say, yeah, because you can always find good indicators and bad indicators. But the Ukrainian army, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union disintegrated into the various republics, there was a lot of hands across the water, or the rubble of the Iron Curtain, trying to be pals with everybody. And so NATO had a bunch of NCO training schools, some very good NCO training schools, and they offered the former Warsaw Pact people, to have students in the NCO schools. The Ukrainians sent some people. The Russians didn't want to at first. But they ended up getting a bunch of concessions. So the Russians sent some NCOs. The Russian students in the NCO academies basically wanted it so they could get to the PX and buy stuff. And they were not very engaged students. The Ukrainians, and it's probably because of maybe that first Ukrainian chief of staff, and I forget who his name was, but he made sure that they sent really good people. They were really engaged, and the Ukrainians then were lobbying over and over to get more slots and more slots and more slots. And the Ukrainians ended up had a big commitment to making a very NATO-style, very professional NCO cadre. So that's explains a lot in terms of why the Ukrainian army fought. That they are that they paid a lot of attention to leadership, to NCO leadership and to officer leadership. And the Russians really haven't. The Russians still don't have a very good NCO cadre. They have to rely on officers for almost everything, including technical matters. And so there's not a lot of, the officers don't have a lot of time to devote to leadership when they have to also be the person that makes sure everything's working administratively and mechanically and everything else. So, now we can kind of look back and see, oh yeah, here's why this happened and here's why this happened. So I don't know that's not an answer to your question yet, but I mean, I don't want to leave the impression that this came out of nowhere. I mean, there really were causative factors there for the Ukrainian army. It wasn't just somebody picked up a flag and already said, yeah. Now there is an element of that. There is an element of patriotism involved here, and a sense of national identity that I think grew out of 2014 and some of the events afterwards in terms of the change of government. Kind of essentially a right-wing coup, but fairly quickly a reestablishment of democracy and a more centrist government. Zelensky has certainly been a very charismatic figure in terms of unifying that country and giving them someone to sit by. And the fact that we're used to leaders who look out for themselves. I mean, the fact that he stuck there in Kiev when there were airborne troops in the city looking for him, and he made a point of going out in the street and holding meetings with his ministers live on the street, using his cell phone to show people that he wasn't just in a studio, he was right there. And so were the rest of the senior members so that sort of leadership accounts for a lot. That right there is a causative factor. When you've got that kind of leadership, people are going to respond. I think it's really interesting that it's been cast as, in some ways, ethnic Ukrainians versus ethnic Russians who lived in Ukraine. And as soon as Russia invaded, almost all not almost, but a huge number of the ethnic Russians in Ukraine said, no, we're not Russian, we're Ukrainians. Yes, I speak Russian. Yes, my family comes from Russia, but we're Ukrainians and, get out of our country. Everybody talks about the Azov Battalion. The Azov Battalion started off as almost all ethnic Russians. And later it got, and there's several battalions from the Donbass region that are, kind of high profile units that started off all ethnic Russians. And now they're a little bit more, now they're more diverse, but this was not, despite the fact that Moscow wants to phrase it that way, this was not a society that was unambiguously breaking along ethnic lines. And so I think the attitude of the government had a lot to do with that, of not making it, this is Ukraine just for Ukrainian speakers. And I say there was a period of that when they had some laws like that right after the change of government, right? If there were some some anti-Russian speaking laws passed. But they'd gotten past that and had opened their society up a bit more. I'm sorry.
I beg your pardon, gentlemen. My chief of staff just informed me that the officers' miss is calling. I'll be backing on.
Okay, Professor Kent, we'll see you. Mr. Chadwick, we promised before that we would take a break. Do you feel like taking a break for 15 minutes?
Sure, 15 minutes. That'd be fine.
Okay,
then we'll come back.
Yeah, definitely, and then we'll get into the topic of how you would approach simulating what's going on in the Ukraine, and
okay,
obviously maybe a little bit on Taiwan, China.
Yeah, sure.
So thank you very much. So, we'll resume at 8:30.
Should we just turn our cameras off and then look instead of logging back in? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I'm the system.
Right. We don't want to chance.
Yeah. Let's not break the internet. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So thank you, Mr. Chadwick. I have actually a question based upon our previous discussion. I'm not sure if you can see it. I've got to sort of see if I'm visible. This is a book. It's sort of hard to see perhaps. It's by Peter Lieberman, who teaches in New York, and it's a book called Does Conquest Pay? And I use it as a counterpoint when I teach my students. He argues that industrialized societies are very easy to occupy. So the German occupation of France in World War II, Soviet occupation of Eastern and Central Europe, Japanese occupation of China, and these are the cases where he examines. And his basic argument is that the cost of occupation is much cheaper than the benefits you get from occupying these societies and getting them to work for you. So his book is, and it sort of applies today if you look at what China is doing in Taiwan. So his book is generally a critique of nationalism and the idea that developed societies often have, which is we have better educated citizenry. And therefore, we will fight smarter, better, harder than farmers. Where his book basically says industrialized people are actually more atomized than farmers. And of course, it's a very complicated debate going back to Vietnam. How conservative are farmers really? But with regard to Ukraine, I would have predicted, based on this book, that they would have been easy to occupy, as easy as Hong Kong. And so their behavior, at least it doesn't align with the phenomenon of France being easily occupied by the Germans in the Second World War. And actually, from my understanding of reading the literature, French society was more or less against the Maquis and the resistance. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. It's sort of that I guess that sociological, that fundamental belief that industrialized people are better equipped to fight hard as opposed to pre-modern people.
That's an interesting question. It's an interesting issue to talk about. I'm not sure I don't have an easy answer for you. I think that industrialized people may be better equipped to fight hard in a conventional army, but they may be less well equipped to fight in an irregular sense. Although the French resistance gets a lot of ink, but the Italian resistance to the second, the nationalist government in the north of Italy was pretty impressive. I have some friends from Italy who say that you go around the cities and you'll find these little plaques everywhere, and it's people who in this building, somebody from this place died fighting in the resistance against the nationalist government. I mean, how would you count Yugoslavia? Would you say that because Yugoslavia essentially very nearly self-liberated during World War II. There was a very impressive resistance movement there. There was a pretty impressive, not nearly as successful, but there was an impressive resistance movement ultimately in Poland. And And of course, in the Soviet Union, and I'm not willing to write, just write them all off as a bunch of peasants, because I mean that's not what Soviet society was like. They put up a very, very spirited and effective resistance. I think France is an unusual case because French society was so divided, and the occupation of France initially was fairly benign. The occupation of Yugoslavia and most of the Eastern was not benign at all, and so that certainly helped coalesce resistance against them. So I don't know. I don't know that I'd say it was as simple as industrial versus agrarian. One of the interesting things, I'm not sure this is even directly related there, but one of the interesting predictors of how bravely soldiers will fight is education, and it's not inverse to education at all. Education and IQ are pretty good predictors of how bravely soldiers will fight. And you would think that would be the opposite, because bright people and educated people have a lot of imagination, so they can imagine a lot of horrible things that might happen to them. But it appears that they are able to, that they think through why. They ask why they're fighting, but they have some answers, as opposed to people from more traditional societies where people of lower IQs or lower education levels are not able to think in abstract terms as to beyond just the moment, but why, down the road, why are we doing this? What future am I choosing? So I mean, and I think that's and I've always thought that was really interesting, that IQ and intelligence you don't normally think of as predictors of courage, but they are. In big number terms, they are. So
may I ask two questions on that? First, what sociological changes need to take place for the Russians to get to that next level? And again, this is pure speculation. If and when the Chinese Marines land on a beach in Taiwan, how are the Chinese soldiers? How do you diagnose the average Chinese soldier, and how do you diagnose the average Taiwanese soldier? I know, crazy questions.
I know. Well, no, they're not. It's not crazy questions, but it's maybe a little above my pay grade, because like I say, I don't feel like I'm comfortable making generalizations about those two societies. But let me talk about the Russians. One of the problems that the Russian army has is also kind of the social contract between Putin and the Russian people. The kind of unspoken social contract, which is, don't bother your pretty little heads about politics. I'll take care of that. Just go about your business. And so there is very little sense of involvement beyond the elite level of the people and the state, the people in the operation of the state, the people in the functioning of the state. And what that translates to is the soldiers have no stake. Their job is to just, do your job and, act like a soldier, except all of a sudden they're in a shooting war. And you can't just invent that stuff. I mean, so you're seeing some cracks opening. I don't know where it's going to go. I have no crystal ball as to what's going to happen with the Russian Federation. But there's certainly some problems showing up. I mean, when you announce that you're going to conscript 300,000 people, and more people than that leave in the course of about a week, there's some problems there. They weren't even going to call up the number of people that crossed the border and got out of the country. So we'll see. But I mean, I think that's a very steep hill to climb with the Russian soldiers in terms of getting them to have a sense of ownership of this war, when they don't have a sense of ownership of anything in that society. Their job is to just shut up and, go through the motions. And that's one thing, but getting shot something else. So I think that has a lot to do with it. And whereas in Ukraine, there is a sense, and you can see it in all the social media stuff. It's not just government propaganda. It's just social media video footage of Ukrainian soldiers going into these Russian ethnic towns, and being welcomed by the people, by the people in the town. It's clear that they feel a sense of ownership of their society that the Russian soldiers don't, and rightly so. I mean, they don't have a sense of ownership at all. It's not, and it's they've never, the government has not really attempted to engender, I think, that sense of ownership in the society.
Well, the Ukrainians welcomed the Nazis too.
They did, because they didn't have much sense of ownership in Soviet society. But they did not welcome the Russians this time, which is kind of interesting. You know, I mean, the Ukrainians did not rise up and welcome. Oh yeah, welcome Russians. You know, when they were moving into these areas.
Gone are the good old days when it was Mother Russia has sons enough, and it's better to die in company.
May I ask whether the experience of combat can instill ownership in the sense of causing the Russian army to revolt? Is that at all on the books, or?
Well, I mean, if it wouldn't be the first time, you know, I mean, 1917. Somebody was making an interesting comment about 1917, which was that for the most part, it was not the frontline soldiers that revolted. It was the conscripts that were being, sent to the front, half trained, without socks. You know, does any of this sound familiar? You know, and again, I'm not making a prediction there, but it is an interesting parallel that if your army is being fed into a meat grinder, and then you round up a whole bunch of people and say, you're next. And by the way, we don't really have, by the way, you're going to provide your own uniforms and stuff. You shouldn't expect really good outcomes. Now, how bad those outcomes are going to be, I don't know. But is there a possibility? I think there's a possibility. I particularly think there's a possibility among conscripts who are not ethnic Russians, because a substantial part of the Russian Federation is not ethnic Russians. It's not Russians. It's not Russian as a first language speaker, but they're getting conscripted too. And there are a lot of people asking, what's in this for us? You know, why are we going to get fed into, because the Russians want, another chunk of territory. So
but before we go into, of course, we could, and there's so many different ways to pursue trying to examine the conflict in Ukraine to a simulation. But I was wondering if I could get some big issues out of the way. The first one is well, I'll just ask both of them immediately. What happened to cyber warfare? That's the first question. And the second one, is there a drone revolution or not?
Is there a drone revolution? I don't. What happened to cyber warfare? Well, it seems to be a little bit of it going on, but I think it surprised everyone how everyone was expecting that the Russians have warehouses full of hackers who are about to bring down everything and make the fuel rods fly out of nuclear reactor stuff, and none of that happened, which suggests. One possible explanation is they aren't as good, and there aren't as many of them as we thought. That the things that we considered, little tentative probes might have been it in terms of their capability. Now, there's been some recent additional cyber action, I think, within the last few days, I believe, against some U.S. Networks. But we'll see. I mean, but it's possible that they just they weren't everything they were cracked up to be, which isn't surprising, because there's a whole bunch of stuff about Russia that's not everything it was cracked up to be. All this all these active defense measures where they, shoot up a thing to knock down the missile and all this sort of stuff. Where was that? We didn't see much of that going on here. I mean, if you read the sales brochures, it sounds really good, but that's a sales brochure. And the product did not apparently perform as well as has been expected. So, so I would say that's the answer on cyber warfare. I don't know for sure. It's not really a field I'm strong in, but it looks to me like they just didn't have the capability we thought. Now, what was the other one?
Yeah, it's the drone revolution, just like the missile revolution of 1973.
No, the drone revolution. There actually is a drone revolution, I think. I mean, if one of the things that's interesting about Ukraine war is it's the first war where both sides have had a lot of drones, and that they're actually integrated into how everything's working. I think we have a pretty good idea of their integration on the Ukrainian side. I don't have as good a handle because the social media stuff's not as good. Let me step back for a minute and say one of the amazing things about this war is it's the first one that's been fought on television, or streaming.
TikTok.
TikTok. I mean, this is a war fought out in the open. You can go online and get situation maps that an intelligence officer in World War II or Vietnam or Korea would have killed for. You can get order of battle information that is more, I was saying to somebody the other day that if you wanted order of battle information like this a couple decades ago, you had to wait for a year or two for ISB and Camps to write a book about it, and then you can get some OB information like that. But now you go on Wikipedia and it's spectacularly detailed order of battle information. And the social media aspect of the war, everybody's got a cell phone. And everybody, when they knock out a tank, look at the tank I knocked out. And so we have pictures of it, and we have the GPS coordinates of exactly where it was, and we see all the markings. And I mean, it's amazing how much open source, civilian, non-military battle damage assessment is going on. So it's in that sense an absolutely unique war. So one of the aspects of it is the drone revolution. I mean, for the first time, they aren't toys that wow, we can let's what can we do with these? They're just functioning on their own. I mean, when we're using them in we've certainly used them a lot in counterinsurgency and asymmetrical warfare, but this is symmetrical conventional warfare with both sides using them, and they're both using them as surveillance, as reconnaissance, and they're both using them in strike missions, and they're having there's a level of balance there. I think that the Russians are catching up with Ukrainians. I mean, we were surprised the Ukrainians were kind of out in the lead of this, but part of that was just their thinking. But I mean, it's having an effect on the use of artillery fire. I mean, artillery fire is so much more effective for a lot of reasons, but one of them is, boy, your targeting is really good. You don't have to have a guy in a church steeple with a pair of binoculars. You got a drone. And the drones are proving pretty difficult to knock down. They're not that sturdy, but they're just hard to acquire, and they can kind of hang around in trees like birds. So it has made a huge difference. A huge difference in targeting, a huge difference in assessment of damage. When they shoot at a bridge, they're going to know whether that bridge is still standing, either from satellite information, which is another aspect of this war that's really been a game changer. But both sides have access to really good satellite information. But yeah, that's one of the ways that's absolutely one of the things that makes the Ukraine war so interesting is the use of drones and how they're not toys anymore. They are completely integrated in what's going on.
Is there a combined arms solution that's going to diminish their effects in the same way that combined arms dealt with anti-tank rockets in the 73 war?
Maybe it will tamp them back to the point where they're not quite so overwhelming. but I think they're here to stay. I mean, there's just such a really good reconnaissance and attack system, and they're so much cheaper than flying. I mean, you don't hear a lot of talk about photo reconnaissance by aircraft anymore. I mean, all of a sudden, the idea of reconnaissance aircraft has become rapidly obsolete. You're not going to put a live pilot in a multi-million-dollar airframe up there to take a picture of something. That you can either get pretty good with satellite imagery, and if not, send in a drone. That's a couple $1,000s. So I think the era of combat aircraft flying reconnaissance really is pretty much over, and I don't think that's going to change. I don't think that's coming back. Can you deal with them as strike aircraft? Well, you can, but it's like you can deal with helicopters, you can deal with strike aircraft, but boy, they're so the cost of them is so much lower, and the human cost of using them is so much lower. You're not putting a pilot. And I've thought for a long time that by now, I've thought for a long time that the current generation of advanced fighters is the last generation that's going to have meat in the cockpit. But I don't know. I mean, every general in the Air Force, almost every general in the Air Force flew a fighter plane once, and I don't think the Air Force wants to give up on that. But the drone might be the way into that. I mean, if they're not air superiority yet, but in terms of a strike system and a reconnaissance system, boy, they're going to save a lot of pilots' lives.
May I ask, as a point of comparison, of course, when the conflict broke out, the first thing I did was I took out your assault series, and we did a sort of a double echelon march formation, lots of smoke, lots of artillery suppression, infantry combined arms, high tempo of operation to get through before the NATO forces could counterattack. By comparison, if we had a 1985's era group of Soviet forces, Germany brigade, would they have performed significantly differently, much better, about the same?
Oh, much better. For one thing, the group of I would assume that if you take a 1985 group of Soviet forces brigade equivalent, it would be a motor rifle regiment or a tank regiment. They weren't the best soldiers in the world, but they were a lot better than these guys. I mean, the group of Soviet forces in Germany was there as a potential deterrent, and the Soviets actually invented the term operational art. A guy by the name of Svechin back in the 20s was the first guy to use the term operational art, they developed it in the 30s. They had developed it pretty well by the time the Germans attacked. They couldn't execute it because of the purge and a lot of other factors that went on. So they couldn't execute worth a damn. But by 43 and 44, they're executing pretty well. And it's not like they have a new doctrine. It's exactly the same doctrine they had in 41. It's just now they've got a force that can execute it. And I think, as near as I can tell, the current Russian army doesn't have that doctrine. It doesn't appear to be that doctrine. It's not based around kinetic, what I'll call kinetic maneuver. It's based around firepower. You don't see battalion tactical groups that are primarily armor. The basic battalion tactical group is 10 tanks, two companies of mechanized infantry, and about a battalion, even though it's called a battalion tactical group, about a battalion of artillery. So the tanks and the infantry are there to just kind of find the targets. It's really a firepower oriented, and they used it to try to do a quick drive to Kiev initially, but it doesn't seem to be set up very well for that. Here's something you're not seeing in this war: big tank battles. And it's not because there aren't a lot of tanks, okay? There's plenty of tanks, but you're not seeing big tank battles because that part of the force on force thing is just not what this war is about.
How do you estimate, again, this is sort of the $1 million question because of the political implications. What's your instinct on losses? What are the actual losses? Are they 60,000 dead, 20,000 dead?
I think they're about a little over half of what Ukraine is claiming. But that's, but I'm outside of those loops. I'm just a guy on the sidelines looking at this. But I think that I think Ukraine is overcounting, but every army in history overcounts. But if you cut Ukraine's losses in half, it's still staggering what's happened to the Russian army. One of the weird things about the reporting on the army early on was how lopsided the numbers were, and the numbers weren't lopsided. If you count every man jack in all the Soviet armed forces, sure, but that includes their nuclear force. It includes a big ocean-going navy that doesn't have much to do. It includes a strategic air force that's throwing nukes, but not in this war. There's a whole bunch of stuff that really doesn't have anything to do with this war. Whereas everything that the Ukrainian army has built for the last 10 years has been aimed at fighting this war. So the number of troops that the Russians were able to throw into Ukraine is actually less than the total armed forces of Ukraine. They certainly threw in more tanks, but not a lot more because they didn't have a lot more. Ukraine has about 1,500 tanks in their inventory. The Russians had over 2,000 in their active inventory, but not all of those things were operationally ready to go.
What does
they didn't have a big edge in force. They had surprise, and they have an edge in long-range missile, battlefield missile. They've got a real edge there. But I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. It's absolutely fascinating. I want to extend your analysis to what we see the Russian army doing or not doing in Ukraine tell us about the quality of the soldiers and the reliability of the soldiers that are in charge of the strategic weapons, the peoples in the silo and the air bases. What quality do you think they have?
Oh, I don't know. They may have a different criteria for recruiting them. That may be, it may be that their high quality manpower is going into strategic forces. I don't have any evidence of that, but I think it's a possibility. But by and large, I'm not seeing a lot of things that are very encouraging. The sinking of the Moskva is kind of interesting because the initial theories, there was a really interesting simulation done of what happened, and that I was pretty impressed with this with the simulation. They simulated the launch of the missiles, and the Moskva took one of the two down, and then at the last minute, the air defense system took out the second one. And so then they put in a little rain, and all of a sudden they didn't even engage at all. I think that's a flaw in the simulation. I don't think that's what was going on. The latest I've heard is that it's quite possible that the Moskva's air defense systems weren't operational. That they were way behind on maintenance, and they had to put to sea anyway because it was the flagship and they needed a ship out there. And so they said, well, we don't think they got any anti-shipping missiles, and out they went, and over and down when they went. And that the air defense stuff may not even have been turned on when they were hit. And I think that's a much more plausible explanation than this: a little bit of rain and a little bit of waves made this really sophisticated air defense system not work.
Sorry.
So I'm not seeing a lot that impresses me. I will say there's one aspect of this war where the Russians surprised me and impressed me. And that was after everything went south at Kiev, and then they made that decision to pull everybody out of the north, everybody back and regroup. And they said, well, they're not going to be able to regroup these guys because they don't know how to do anything. They put in a series of attacks in the Donbass that really impressed me, because what they did was the Ukrainians had the line was a series of strong points on high ground for observation purposes, and that's where their mechanized forces were dug in, and they had light infantry in the intervals, holding that ground. And the Russians hit the strong points with not their first echelon troops, but their second echelon troops. And when, as pinning attacks, and then their best stuff, the VDV and the Spencer, they hit the intervals, overran that light infantry, blew through, and then enveloped from behind and over. And that's when they kind of blew a hole in the Ukrainian lines, and they were running. So that their ability to switch up from that first fiasco, put that together, think that through, and kind of play to their strengths, that really impressed me. And if you remember back in May and June, all of a sudden the Ukrainians were on the ropes. There were a lot of units in the Donbass area from social media reports that were saying their morale was tanking. They were saying our commanders are just getting us killed. They don't know what they're doing. Fortunately, that attack ran out of steam for some other reasons, I think. But I mean, I would say that's the one thing that the Russians have done in this that shows a glimmer of a real thoughtful approach to the problem.
I think you're completely right that the Russian Achilles heel is maintenance and logistics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that has a tendency to put a damper on any kind of operations.
Mm-hmm.
May I ask you to make a comparison with your observations about the successful Russian attack and the Russian reinvention during the invasion of Finland? Mm-hmm. What would need to happen in Russia for the Russians to make that scale of repair to their doctrine, their leadership, their philosophy, so that they can do what they did in Finland? Because they suffered enormously, but then they it seemed that they really came together, and that was right. In a communist system. So seemingly they fought for the system and for Stalin.
But in the Soviet Union, especially in that early time, despite all the horrible stuff going on, people did have a sense of investment in the culture, and particularly the Russians had a sense of investment. That you can say what you like about Stalin, and whatever you say, it's true, But there was a sense of ownership in that culture, in that society. That they could always call on. There was that, we talk about Holy Mother Russia and everything, but there was a reservoir of that they could draw on. What would it take for I think that the Russians have already had that moment, that reinvention was when they pulled everything out, when they reorganized, and people were saying they couldn't be, and then they put in those attacks. That was their reorganization, but it's run out of steam. And one of the things that enabled it and maybe will prevent it from being repeated is that one of the ways they put that together was by stripping all of their training establishments of personnel. They gutted the training, their training facilities, and they put all those people in the line, and that gave them that oomph to go. But now what do? So now they were conscripting people, and some of the social media pictures from the conscripts are pretty grim. Basically just a bunch of guys without uniforms sitting around oil barrels with drums in them, drinking vodka out of gallon jugs. I think they may have damaged their ability to actually reinvent the army.
May I ask? It looks like the Russian army has been coup-proofed far more than it was during the Soviet era. And I found it difficult to ascertain precisely how much military training Putin had. But I'd always assumed that you have a popular Russian culture. The army, originally meant to protect the party, now it protects the people. I had assumed the army had some sort of institutional self-awareness where they could at least threaten Stalin or Putin by, you have to give us what we need to defend ourselves. But it doesn't seem to be happening. It seems to be, now we have a new commander. It seems somehow Putin and the FSB have somehow diminished this independent military institution and its demands. What do you think is going on?
I think it started with Brezhnev, to be honest. I think before then there was still some idealism in the party, and it misplaced as it may have been. I think Nikita Khrushchev really was trying to do a good job for the Soviet Union. Brezhnev was in it for the money. I mean, Brezhnev was the beginning of the era of gross corruption, and it got worse and worse and worse through Brezhnev, and then it's just carried on. I mean, the level of corruption in Russian society is staggering, and it really impacts not just logistics. I mean, but also the will to fight. Because, I mean, if your soldiers can see that your battalion commander is just all this is a way for him to make money by selling the spare parts from your maintenance stores and selling gasoline on putting it in his own pocket. I mean, where are you going to find, and up the chain of command, there's nobody there to say to Putin, hey, because they're crooks. I mean, it's just riddled with crooks. So yeah, there's a new commander. Okay, how many does that make that they've fired and put in charge of it? You know, and how long is he going to last? He's the new scapegoat. Now, if you look on Russian media now, they can't criticize Putin, but there is growing criticism in the Russian media of the generals. The generals are terrible. Well, so yeah, so they just fired one and they put another one in, and then in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, they'll fire him. He'll be the new scapegoat because it can't be Putin, right?
One way to solve that: blood purge.
Yeah, it always works, right? Yeah.
But I try to apply the same rules to Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, had its Maidan revolution, but that was 8 years ago now. That's not I mean, it's not a long time. It's certainly less than it's less than half of a generation. Ukraine, their per capita income, obviously they don't have the benefits of oil, but their per capita income is I think it was like 2,000. Sort of not purchasing power parity, but GDP. So it was a fraction of what the Russian per capita income was. Ukraine was very corrupt. So somehow the Maidan revolution happens. Within 8 years, there's sufficient political culture generated by that experience to completely transform the society from one that was extremely corrupt to one that was not. And Russia's been left behind. I mean, so I'm wondering why. What was it about the revolution, do you think, in Kiev that was sufficient to completely change the society, when what's happening in Russia, it's so blatantly absurd. I mean, and the Russians are paying a much higher price than the Ukrainians did, in the revolution in Kiev. They could have just, gone on with the corrupt government. Why did Ukraine completely transform itself and Russia just resists?
That's a good question, and it's again, that's a little beyond my pay grade. I can tell you what I think. Some of the things I think. One of them is that I don't think the revolution, the Ukrainian revolution, really is what did it, because there's certainly a criticism of it that said that the purpose of the revolution was to trade oligarchs who looked to Moscow for oligarchs who looked to the European Economic Community. But it's and instead of Moscow, it's now the International Monetary Fund who's sucking money out of the economy. So the first part of that changed the focus to the West, but it didn't. I don't think it really had much effect on it was who the oligarchs were, but not that. Since then, there has been. And I'm reluctant to attribute too much of it to Zelensky, but Zelensky is certain, if he's not causative, he's certainly emblematic of a change in attitude. And I don't even know if I don't know how much you know about Zelensky's background, but everybody knows he's a comedian. I don't know if you know about his show, his TV show. He had a 2-season show, and in the show, he's a high school teacher who's its history. He's just giving all these, he's really railing about how corrupt and how stupid and all this stuff is. And his students basically started a movement to get him elected. And they've taped all this stuff, and it goes viral on social media, all these rants about the corruption in the government and self-serving politicians and stuff. And he gets elected. And so he's the president of Ukraine. And it's all about him negotiating all this stuff with the IMF and oligarchs and trying to, and the legislature is not behind him, but it's all about reforming Ukraine. And so, and it got to be so popular, he was elected. He ran on the platform of this comedy series. I mean, well, satire, political satire. And in fact, I think that the party in that is the name of his party, his actual party. So, I mean, that's who the guy is. I mean, he is definitely committed to the notion of reform. And like I said, I'm not sure he's the sole cause, but he's certainly become an emblem of it for some pretty good reasons. He sold it for 2 years in that show. He sold the idea of the government's job was to work for the people, not the oligarchs. That's not to say all those problems are gone. I mean, it's not. It was still a work in progress, but it's that sort of thing that can give people hope in a sense that, yeah, we can take the society back. So,
if I may,
guy.
No, it's fascinating watching personalities. Obviously, I mean, there's a trend where the historians look at elite figures. Then there's, of course, trend looking at sort of mass behavior, but single individuals can have a huge disproportionate impact. I mean, obviously, Alexander the Great, clearly. But if I may ask, there was Mansur Olson was an economist, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and he did a study comparing the bureaucracy of I think it was Great Britain during the Napoleonic Wars, the First World War, and the Second World War, and he argued that the British far and away had the most efficient bureaucracy compared with the state-heavy Napoleonic system, Wilhelmine Germany, and the supposed totalitarian system in World War II Germany, and he argued that was a major reason for why the British were able to prevail. They had more efficient bureaucracy. They could extract more resources. They were more essentially self-sufficient in food compared to their adversaries. Of course, you've just diagnosed Ukraine as possibly still having the same top-heavy economic ownership. Do you see evidence of Ukraine organizing itself? But I'm not sure how. I mean, one of my thoughts is that a large part of the population that left, of course, the men were not allowed to leave, I think, until the age of 60, but a large part of the population, mostly women and their children, fled initially in the conflict, thinking that West Ukraine could have been overrun, and it would have been a very difficult environment. But I don't know how many have returned, but it didn't look like a levée en masse to me. It didn't look like, we have to get serious. All the women must report to a factory. The men will fight. I actually I have no sense of I'm wondering if Ukraine isn't actually fighting the war, basically not on the cheap, but basically relying on Western weapons and then not having to make those difficult choices of changing how their society is organized.
I don't know that I'd agree with that, but I can't refute it. I will say that I think that the decision to that all men are basically in the military, subject to does not appear to have been met with resistance or resentment. I mean, it's all anecdotal, but the stuff I've seen of how the Ukrainians coped in Kiev, for example, during what was essentially a siege, it is an awful lot of pitching in and helping at every level. I think one of the real telling points is that there are 26 territorial defense brigades. I think that's the number. It's 26 oblasts. Each oblast has a territorial defense brigade. And it's like 4 to 8 battalions, but they're only cadres and NCOs and officers, and then they if wartime comes, then they fill them up. Well, they've been filling them up. There's some of them that are now in the line as light infantry brigades. But what's really interesting is that all these pictures of, you know, these Soviet, old habits die hard, Russian tank columns that have been ambushed on the roads, you know, up in the rear areas moving up towards Kiev in the early part of the fighting. That's almost all done by those territorial units. It's guys who live in the area, showed up, put on some kind of uniform. Now they got javelins and laws, but they would put in these kind of bypassed areas cadres of their special operations force units, and so they'd be the cadre. But it's mostly the territorials who are out doing all this damage to Russian tank columns and armored personnel carriers and IFVs with these new light anti-tank weapons. That early on in the war, the part of the force structure that you would think would be the least effective was arguably doing some of the most damage. And it was doing it just the way you'd expect. I mean, because they knew the countryside, they could move through the woods, they could take their shots and then melt away. So to me, that argues that there is that sort of self-organizing and definitely pulling together and trying to get the job done.
There's just so damn much of an indicator. I was doing some order of battle work for a government contract on the Ukrainians, and I was just astounded at the depth of their bench on these reserve type forces. I thought, oh my gosh, how in the hell can they support that? And I said, there must be a hell of a force, and they turned out to be that way.
Well, they've got it's hard. All the information is there, but it's actually hard to find it because the Ukrainians have got forces squirreled away everywhere. I mean, it's really strange. They've got, you look at their National Guard, which is not part of the ground forces. It's part of kind of internal security and it's a lot of crowd control and stuff like that. But they've also got like 5 operational regiments that are motorized infantry. They've got 4 or 5 operational brigades that are equipped like as a motorized brigade, one of which I talked about is the 4th Rapid Response Brigade, which is probably the most combat effective brigade in the Ukrainian army, or at least was at the start of the war. There's a lot of other people have got a lot of experience since then. They've got 5 special state facility protection regiments that are guarding major military factories, and they've got 5 special state facility defense battalions, which are guarding their 5 major nuclear power sites.
There are a bunch of these units that had been raised during the Donbass mess, and they've been promoted up to higher and better equipped units, and then they've backfilled them with more folks.
Right, and you find a lot of guys in the National Guard that are actually those units. I mean, like the Azov Battalion is technically in the National Guard, but it's in this composite brigade that was done in Melitopol. You just keep digging and finding more units that are, that have tanks, armored personnel carriers. They look like military units to me. You look at their ground forces, that's pretty good. They got they had a couple tank brigades, and they have about a dozen. They've got more than that now. They've raised a bunch of additional brigades since the war started. They got 22 mechanized brigades, I think now, and I think it started with like about a dozen. But you get done with it, and you say, that's a pretty good sized force. Oh, wait. Air assault forces, that's a different branch. That's not ground forces. 8 brigades of airborne and air assault forces.
Oh yeah.
And so, okay, then what else? Navy. Well, the Navy, they have naval infantry, and they've got like 2 full brigades of naval infantry and a division headquarters and a bunch of artillery. I mean, you just keep finding, it's like opening closets and finding more units. So it's a very, it's a heavily armed country, and with a lot of units that appear to be, as near as I can tell, pretty good.
They've come a long way in a decade.
Yes, they have. They've come a long way.
May I re-ask a question earlier, because you raised the issue of the javelins. So I'll re-ask the question just because it's very salient in the media. How would the Soviets have responded to the NLAW and the javelin? Do you think?
How have they?
No, how would they? The Soviet 1985 era.
Oh, the Soviets.
How would they have dealt with it?
The Soviets would have. I think the way they would have dealt with it is they would have had something that the Russian army, when they went in, didn't have, which is, it's going to surprise you, dismounts. They were so under strength that to man they wanted to man all the vehicles of these mechanized units. The companies were under strength anyway, and they ended up with not enough guys to dismount. I mean, you see, a squad would be the vehicle crew and maybe a guy with a machine gun, but they couldn't. They just weren't enough dismounts. And the way you deal with all those things is with dismounts. I think that's one of the lessons in this war, is that the main protection that keeps tanks from blowing up is not their armor, because it's mostly not tank battles. The armor of a unit is its dismounts, and the Russians went in without dismounts. And so now there's this huge premium, as you're reading about, everybody's looking for infantry. Everybody's looking for infantry, because it's the infantry dismounts that keep your tanks from getting killed by those things. They keep the territorial defense guys who know from sneaking up on you in the ravine. So that's an essential part of security, and they're not just sneaking up and knocking out tanks. They're knocking out self-propelled artillery. You've got to have the dismounts to keep infiltrators away from all your high firepower stuff.
So you can see that back to World War II, that the infantry takes care of the things that bother the tanks, and the tanks take care of the things that bother the infantry.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. And the Russians went in effectively without any dismounts, except in the VDV units, which were all dismounts, all the Soviet airborne, the Russian airborne. I will never completely overcome that tick.
But so the 300,000 soldiers being trained, how long does it take to train a previously trained conscript to be a competent infanteer? Or are the 300,000 sort of second grade conscript, is it going to be just a waste? They're not going to chase the javelin launchers. What's your instinct?
My sense is that if there is a reasonable time that it will take, they're not going to get that time. That they're already sending some of the conscripts up to the front. In fact, some of the guys, and they're sending them up in not as fillers. In some cases they are, but in some cases they're sending up in kind of units, just big clumps of guys. Because what's the town that just got surrounded and starts with an L? I'm just blanking on its name. But surrounded and then captured just within the last week. What's that?
Oh yeah, no, sorry, no, I don't know that town.
Okay, but there were a bunch of guys there who were really pissed off. I mean, and all this stuff is on social media, because the regulars pulled out and left them as the rear guard. Basically, you guys stay, and the regulars pulled out, and these guys were all just a bunch of untrained conscripts, and some of them got out, and some of them didn't. So far, they don't seem to be, I'm not seeing any evidence that they're making any progress at training these guys. I mean, when you see pictures of the training areas that are sometimes just open fields where they got a bunch of guys sleeping on mats, I don't see any training going on. And like I said, since they stripped their training cadre out and sent it to the front, I'm not sure how they're going to go about training them. It's not to say they can't figure it out. and it's not, you know, and the stuff you're seeing on the social media stuff you're seeing is maybe not representative. So we'll see, but
yeah, there might be it might be a selection effect. May I ask about your estimate of HIMARS? I mean, it has got a lot of saliency in the media. I beam count. It looks like one single brigade of artillery. Is it?
I think a reinforced battery would be closer to what in terms of the numbers they've got. But I'll tell you, I'm not a big guy on silver bullet weapon systems, but HIMARS was a game changer. I talked earlier about that Russian attack finally collapsing, and it appeared at that point the Russians went over to just mass artillery fire, and the satellite, you could see satellite imagery of like the front and with dots where the artillery strikes were, because it shows up on infrared from satellite of the flash of the detonation, and day after day the whole Ukrainian line was just blanketed. The HIMARS showed up, and within about a week, it stopped because it was a weapon system that, between satellite imaging and drones, could really pinpoint a target. And what they did, and this is one of the things I think one of the ways the Ukrainians have been really smart in this war, is the Russians were using so much artillery ammunition, they were bringing it, most of their logistics is railroad-based anyway. But the rail lines come in, unload tons of ammunition in a big dump, and then the trucks radiate out from that, getting into the things. The HIMARS just started taking out artillery ammo depots, just one after another, and all of a sudden, the artillery fire stopped because the water stopped coming out the end of the hose. And I mean, it was really remarkable seeing it on the map when you look, and all of a sudden, all those artillery flashes are just gone. So it really is, there aren't many of them, but boy, it's been a game changer. It's been a game changer. And now they're getting some MLRSs, which are the same weapon system. It's just, it's got 2 pods instead of 1. And it's not quite as fast on the road.
And it's armored.
What's that? And it's armored. Well, the HIMARS is kind of armored, but it's wheeled. Now, by comparison, the M777s that everybody was, they got a lot of ink too at first, and they haven't made much difference. And the problem is, another thing about this war is that, you know, this is 2 first-tier countries with modern counter-battery radar and an integrated system for using it. And those things work fine in Afghanistan, where you're sitting on a hill and, you know, nobody else has got anything like counter-battery radar. In this environment, towed artillery just can't survive. Mm-hmm. I was hearing, it was one Ukrainian artillery officer who was saying that, you know, they're nice, but we can't get more than like 5 or 6 rounds out before we get counter-battery fire. And since it's, and yeah, your gunners can take cover, but he says then there's all this complicated stuff on the gun carriage that gets messed up by shrapnel, and then we have to send it to Poland to get it fixed, because the ordnance shops for fixing them are in Poland, and so they're in action for an hour or 2, and then they're on the train back to Poland. Which is why it has to be self-propelled. You know, you fire and then you move away, because they know exactly where you fired from as soon as you shoot. And so that's why they didn't make the difference that everybody was expecting them to make. I think I don't know if they got Paladins yet. I think we're at the point of getting them M109 Paladins. They'll make a difference. But the big difference, the HIMARS have made the big difference. They've got the range and the precision to just they've been taking out bridges in the Kherson area to isolate that thing, a capability they didn't have before.
And they can move out.
What's that?
They can move out.
Right. They shoot and then move out. That's right. Mm-hmm.
So I have a question from Attila, who's a graduate student here at Concordia. So yeah, Attila.
Yeah, hi. So I arrived a little bit late because I had class until now, so I apologize if this might have been covered. But if the Russians were to use chemical weapons in the war, what effect do you see it having, and how do you gamify it effectively? Because when I'm looking at the incentives for the Russians to use chemical weapons, with enough of a force multiplier that they might provide, the incentives might become too great of a risk to ignore, I think, and put it in the favor of them using it. And to the question of gamifying it, on one hand, the psychological effect they have, I see it as being a bit difficult to quantify. And also the difficulty and maneuverability that it creates, because the wind can be unpredictable, and like just the difficulty that persisting agents might create in maneuverability. And also to the point you were making on the survivability of like towed artillery. A lot of these like delivery systems will be like, you know, through artillery, just old-fashioned howitzers and such. So that makes it much more difficult for them to use as well. Like how could that then even affect the incentives that I was talking about, right? So yeah, what do you think?
Okay, the first thing I'll say is I think that right now there's probably not a lot of towed artillery left around in action. The Ukrainians were mostly self-propelled artillery in their mechanized forces. Most of their towed artillery was in their, I won't call them second line, but they were their mountain and Jaeger units, and they had some in their motorized brigades, not mechanized, and they had about 4 motorized brigades. But honestly, if that stuff's in combat, I think most of their towed artillery is probably gone. And I will get to your question, but the interesting thing about the Ukrainian force structure is you've got all these brigades, and every one of those brigades, in addition to everything else, has a 12-gun battalion of T-10 towed 100mm anti-tank guns. Okay, every Ukrainian brigade has one of those, and I have never seen one of those in any of this footage. You know, I think those things got left in the warehouse. Because what are you going to do with them? If this is not a war where you're fighting mass tank attacks, and it's not a war where towed artillery can survive. So I think a lot of the towed artillery is gone. I don't think chemical warfare is I've never been as impressed by it, I guess, as some people. It is very difficult to use well. It's not just wind, it's also precipitation and humidity, and not just wind direction, but wind speed. I mean, it can be blowing in the right direction. If it's blowing a little bit too fast, it's going to disperse too soon. And a friend of mine was actually is one of the guys at Game Designers Workshop back in the old days. He was in the National Guard, and they would go on maneuvers, and they, like every year, they do this big exercise. And he said that he was the what was he in the? He wasn't the chemical NCO, but he was like something involved in that. But he said whenever they were on exercises, there would come a certain point when all the weather conditions were just right, and all of a sudden the enemy wasn't attacking anymore. And he said, we never suffered a single assessed casualty from chemicals, because we always knew when it was coming. You know, because the first thing they're going to do is not push their guys forward. They're going to back off. And in those rare cases when the conditions are right. Now, what kind of anti-gas capability do the Ukrainians have? I don't know. But from what I've seen, the Russians don't either. I mean, these guys don't look like they're in mop suits, you know, with. So I don't think their forces are prepared to work in a chemical environment. And if your own forces aren't protected, and I mean, these new recruits, you know, they're not protected because they don't even have uniforms. So I just don't see it as a real. It will cause so much grief everywhere, and I don't think it'll do them much good militarily. I don't think it's going to be. It would be a force multiplier for them.
The great age
of
chemicals was positional warfare, WW1.
Yeah,
and there was no place to go, essentially.
Yeah.
But if I may, it's sort of a related question. I hate to sort of plug these books from the 1990s, but this is a book by Pape on bombing to win, and his basic argument in a survey of every act of bombing was that bombing never works. And of course, so he went to academic war with the Air Force, who obviously didn't endorse the book. But you either have cases like Hungary, who are so terrified of being bombed that they cut a deal with the American Air Force behind the Germans back during World War II, or they've already incorporated the costs and they just suffer. And so we see, not many war games have a table that attempts to estimate the effects of punishment when you bomb people. And yet we have Putin. I mean, I'm not sure what he's doing. He seems to believe this works. I think it was Stephen Zaloga in his book on V1s and V2s, who I think quoted Tizard, who I think was Winston Churchill's science advisor, who said, let them fire V1s and V2s. They absorb half of Germany's explosive chemicals. And it's a fantastic way. So how would you model what Putin is doing? And also, just a question of leadership psychology. What does he think he's doing? And what's the actual effect of it? I mean, if we've had a week of sort of shock and awe, he's hit 20 cities, he hit Zaporizhia, apartment buildings are coming down. Are we observing nothing? Are we observing something? And how do we approach what we think what the Ukrainian reaction is to this?
We kind of mentioned this earlier when we were talking about this notion of what are the victory conditions. That's always the big question in war, as opposed to in a game. In a game, you know what the victory conditions are. In a war, you never do. You don't know exactly what it's going to take to make the other guy give up. And if you think it's easy, ask the U.S. Army in Vietnam, because we never figured out the victory conditions. We never figured out what it would take to make the Vietnamese say, okay, you won. And that's what you got to do. You got to make them say, either kill everybody or make them say, okay, you win. And we never figured that out. And figuring that out is really important. Now, in World War II, we figured it out. The types of societies we were engaged with, it was sufficient to occupy them. Okay, defeat their armies in the field and physically occupy their country, and they give up. Didn't work with Yugoslavia in World War II. Their army was defeated in the field, their country was completely occupied, and the Germans never figured out how to make them give up, and they never did. So I mean, it's not a trivial question. So in terms of the Ukrainians and how they're going to react to this, my guess is that they will just be that much more pissed at the Russians, as opposed to being more pissed at their own government for getting them in this. I mean, and also they're really the two options. Who are you going to be pissed at because something terrible has just happened, and you're going to have to be mad at somebody about it. And I think the anger is going to be Russia directed, which means it will harden their resolve, as opposed to their own government directed, which will weaken their resolve.
So, but given a limited amount of resources, in this case, rockets, what the heck is Putin thinking? I mean, is he going for sort of?
That's a different question. That's a different question. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, what he's doing matters. It's he's if he's wrong, he's burning a lot of resources.
My guess, and I have no access to Putin's mind, nor do I really want to walk around in there. But my guess is this is an act of desperation, that he's running out of options. In terms of what he's thinking, the best explanation I've heard, it's easy to say, Putin's crazy, Putin's a madman, all this sort of stuff. But the best explanation I heard was from a guy who is a Putin watcher and has been studying him for a long time. And he's given some lectures and stuff. And he was saying that when Putin first became president, it's not that he was a good guy, but he was making pretty good decisions, given his frame of reference, and what he wanted to accomplish and his understanding of how things worked. His decision making was pretty good. There's this thing, we may as well call it dictator's disease, where once you're in charge, over the course of time, dissent, even if you don't want it to, disappears. And if you want it to, it really goes away. You don't end up with anybody telling you anything but what you want to hear. And at a certain point, you become uncoupled from reality, because you can't get an honest answer to any question. So, I mean, I think that's the easiest explanation for what Putin's mindset was going into this, that he just couldn't make good decisions because he doesn't have access to good information, to factual information. Everything is, he thought the Ukrainians won't fight because he wanted to think the Ukrainians won't fight, and everybody around him knew that, and so they told him, don't worry, the Ukrainians won't fight. And it's hard to escape that loop at a certain point. That's one of the advantages of pluralistic government, is you never end up in that situation. I mean, there's always people telling you the opposite side. But that's the weakness, I think, of autocratic governments, is that they always end up in that's what a self-affirming bullshit loop is really what it amounts to. So did somebody tell him all you got to do is bombard the cities and they'll give up? Well, maybe was it several weeks earlier or a week or so earlier, it was bombard their electrical generation plants and they'll give up, because they did a wave of that earlier, and then they did it again this time. But I just don't think he's getting a good enough information to make good decisions.
No, thank you. If I may, I guess turn the spotlight on the Russians and observe, we haven't seen any large-scale surrendering by the Russians. I mean, I think there have been some staged issues. So it makes me think that on some I guess a cryptic level, there's a political culture of I guess obedience or service, and the Russians are probably taking a pretty severe beating, but they're not collapsing. So I mean, there's some very robust political culture there. I'm wondering if and of course we spoke about this a lot, but I'm wondering if we can try to detect the contours of it. What will it take for them to start, even in defeat, starting to give up, or should we never expect them to surrender, but maybe surrender by walking back towards the Russian-Ukrainian border?
I don't think we know everything that's going on there. The reason I say that is because if you watch Ukrainian updates, the kind of the bloggers who do their YouTube channels, who are all very pro-Ukrainian, they're always talking about how we're going to surround the Russians. We're going to surround the Russians. And it never happens. It never happens. And I don't know why, but there are a couple possible explanations. One of them is that the Ukrainians are deliberately leaving what Sun Tzu called the golden bridge to, whatever. They are deliberately leaving exposed but viable escape routes for these potential pockets, so they never hunker down and fight to the end. And then we would have mass surrenders from that sort of thing. But they're never closing the pockets quite in time. It's just like, and maybe it's because the Ukrainians just aren't as good at mobile warfare as they need to be to close those pockets. But boy, it's interesting that they never quite close them, isn't it? So I wouldn't put it to determination necessarily on the part of Russians, but I just don't know why. I have sense there's something going on there we don't understand, and in 6 months or a year we will. But it is an interesting phenomenon that you're not getting a lot of surrenders.
Well, there's the opposite view there too, that if you do close them off, then maybe they will have some reason to fight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I think it might be, I'm not saying it is, but it might be volitional on the part of the Ukrainians to not give them that incentive to hunker down and fight. But it also may just be they're trying, they're just not making it, but I can't tell which it is.
Of course, you've warned me several times, of course, it's very difficult to make predictions. Wars are very rare. I mean, if you look at all the possible combinations of war since Napoleon, It's less than 200 interstate conflicts, and statistically, you can't even come to a determination because there's so few. But it's a way for us to test our assumptions. What do you think is going to happen? It's a crazy open-ended question. 6 months from now, 12 months from now, what do you think is going to happen based upon you observing this phenomenon?
Well, of course, if nothing happens to change the momentum's definitely flowing with the Ukrainians right now. I mean, I would not have said that in June. In June, it was looking pretty bad, I thought they were on the verge of cracking, but they've really turned it around. I think right now what it looks like is there's somebody in the Ukrainian high command who's really got his head screwed on right. One of the things that's really difficult with all satellite imagery, and I don't know how they pulled this off, but everybody's got satellite imagery. There's all this social media stuff out there all over the place. Everybody knows where everything is. How did they hide like 4 or 5 maneuver brigades at full strength and smack them in the north out of nowhere? I mean, that was just brilliantly set up. For weeks it was, we're coming to Kherson. Hey, that's where our big offense is going to be. And the Russians pulled stuff out of the north and moved it to Kherson, and then smack out of nowhere, they hit them. And that was brilliant. So now they actually are putting in gaining some ground in Kherson. The offensive in the north's kind of stopped. In Kherson, they're gaining ground. This isn't a prediction, okay? And this is all, armchair generaling, and I don't know what the logistical situation is. I don't know where the reserve situation is and where they are, any of that stuff. But I'd be willing to bet there's a bunch of people in the Ukrainian high command looking at a map and saying, Zaporozhye to Melitopol to the Isthmus. And that ends the war, if they can pull it off. Because it opens the Crimea to reoccupation, and instead of banging head on against all those stuff up in Kherson after they've sucked all those reserves in there, it cuts them off right completely. It cuts off all their supply line, and we'll see. But I mean, I'm not saying they're going to do that, because there's a lot of variables that I don't know. But boy, there's got to be guys looking at the map and saying, "Geez, talk about the big solution. This is a way to end this."
Yeah, I put that. I think I put that on my Twitter account quite a while back, as well as many others. And Little Heart said, "Always do the unexpected." So I basically apologized on the Twitter account. Ukrainians, I don't think anyone.
There's so much noise in the channel. There's so much noise in the channel. If there's a Russian intelligence officer listening to us, he's wasting. He's really. Yeah. I know. I mean, no one foresaw the Ukrainian operation on Izium. I think that was I didn't find anybody. It was the least likely place, I thought, to hold an operation. If I'm asking you a technical question, which occurred to me, 1960s, 1970s, a large increase in urbanization. The prediction was urban environments were going to become sort of quasi-fortifications, very difficult to sort of dig out the infantry, urban environments into sort of electronic systems and radios. But we're seeing a lot of fluidity. I mean, the Russians seem to shell urban areas, and with my students, we pulled out this Barbarossa game, 8 kilometers to the hex. So you can put out a map from Crimea to the Baltic, a ridiculously large map, and we had to double the number of urban hexes. This is, of course, Second World War. So Ukraine is heavily urbanized, a lot of urban strips, but urban areas, it seems the Russians and Ukrainians pass through them That's not my impression. If you look at the detailed updates from some of the military bloggers who talk about the progress day by day by day, it's always they took this village. It's always the urban. It's like the cells are the urban areas because they have visibility, they have cover and visibility. You've got to take them. You can't go past them. So all of this line fighting is village by village or town by village or town, and that's kind of the way everybody marks. And you'll see this village goes, boom, here's the new chunk of ground, controlled, but the control is caused by the urban areas. So the urban areas have become really important. Now the Russians bypassed everything at the very beginning. How'd that work out? Yeah.
No, that's right. It's we were always trained to attack to the objective and then get past it because artillery's coming down, right?
Yeah.
And so if in an advance to contact, you present a sergeant with a couple of buildings in the middle of an open field, that's the last place you're supposed to go. They're going to give you limited security. But no, I think you're right. I mean, the value of the urban strips, and that's what they're fighting for, and sort of leapfrogging from one to the other, we have just a few minutes left. So I mean, I guess unfairly, but asking you questions about the components. If you were going to simulate this in a way where you have the balance between something which is playable pedagogically, so people could. How would you start? How would you start with what scale? I don't even know how to design a war game because I've never done one, and you've done 200. How would you abstract what we're looking at in the Ukraine?
I do it. I do it brigade level because I think the brigades are the operant. They're the real change, the currency that on the ground the war is being fought with. I would differentiate between assault and fire. Fire being the modern term. We used to call it indirect fire. Now it's just fires, but it essentially ranged. And almost all these units have that is a dual capability, and it's not so much a question of are you going to use your artillery or not. It's a question of what is the brigade going to, what sort of attack is it putting in? Is it trying to cause casualties, or is it trying to take ground? And that which will also cause casualties, but it's in the first case, you're not really trying to take ground, you're just trying to attrit. In the second case, you're going for position. And I think the dynamics of those two things are different, but can be modeled pretty easily at that level in terms of the values that you give for those different things. I would definitely be looking at unit cohesion and doing some real thoughtful look at who can, at cohesion levels of units and how that affects their force. And I'd be thinking really hard about victory conditions in terms of will to fight and what's in that. Somebody asked that earlier, and it's not completely idle. I've been thinking, if you're going to do this, the war, you need to give the Russians the possibility of a quick win. But if that quick win doesn't pan out, then it's a different. Then you're in for a long fight. And what are the sorts of components of that in terms of morale? And I think a lot of that has to do with taking key positions. There's been a lot of fighting to take key positions, and it's had an effect on morale. When the Ukrainians see cities falling to them again, being liberated, morale's, it makes a difference. When they see their guys just sitting there getting pounded and pounded and pounded, morale goes down. Those are the, I don't know if that's enough of an answer, but that's the start. That's certainly where And obviously, I'm thinking about that very thing. So it's not impossible for me to start with some parameters that I'm looking at.
Would there be a Zelensky piece? I mean, can we look at Ukraine and Russia as sort of an aggregate, where that you have sort of a bell curve distribution, but generally most of the people are in the mean, or do we have sort of dramatic differences in the leaders?
I don't know that I have a Zelensky piece, but I think the game would have to take into account some options. Well, a clear option for attempting to take Zelensky out, which and success has an impact on Ukrainian morale, but failure has an impact as well. If you can get a big hit if you can take Zelensky out, but if you don't, it's the fact that you tried and failed is a different sort of big boost for Ukrainian morale. So those sorts of things are gambles, and I think those gambles have to be incorporated.
Yeah, because I mean, of course, there's the whole historiography around Napoleon, where of course anyone who games that does give a lot of power to the individual marshals, because they're but of course we have a lot of biographies of those individuals that we don't have right now.
And I don't sense that Zelensky is the guy out there sticking pins in a map and saying, move the 92nd Mechanized Brigade over here. I think he has my sense of him is that he has a really good notion of what his job is as president, and it doesn't involve being a Marshal of France. Okay, it's not telling the generals how to run the war. It's letting the generals run the war, and maybe saying war policy, but no, not what Napoleon did at all, and not what right now Putin appears to be doing. Putin really appears to be micromanaging that war. I'll tell you a big question. Here's an interesting question that I haven't heard anybody ask. Maybe I've just missed it. But we know that the Ukrainians have got, they've got about 20 mechanized brigades in the field. They got about 5 tank brigades now with the reserve stuff coming online. They've got 20-some territorial brigades, but not all of them are in the field as light. But there's probably about a half dozen light infantry brigades from those territorials, 8 air mobile brigades, yada, 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 okay? All these brigades, they've got 4 military district headquarters and then brigades. I don't believe it. It violates everything we know about span of command. Okay, you can't have the Eastern Military District running directly all these brigades, but I can't find any intermediate command level in there. So I'm very anxious to find out what's going on. I mean, that's with all this stuff we know about these, all this detailed stuff, I can't find any evidence of that intermediate command level. Now, for the Russians, you've got the Combined Arms Army headquarters and then the occasional division headquarters. They've got that extra echelon between military district and them. Can't find it for the Ukrainians, and I can't believe it's not there. So there's a big mystery. If anybody knows that, I'd love to hear everybody's theory, but I haven't even heard anybody speculate about that. And it's just impossible to think that all these are being run directly by one headquarters.
I couldn't figure out how you did your research for Suez 73. I mean, and you had a very long discussion about how you worked on the OOB for that, and frankly, that was not a transparent conflict. I mean, probably. So we have one more question, Attila.
Yeah, how do you model then changes in military effectiveness over time, like training or just learning throughout the conflict about like adapting to different technologies or just different tactics over time?
So in any particular conflict, or you mean if we were doing it, if we're talking about the Ukraine war?
Either one, like I was thinking about Ukraine and like just specifically, but like I mean, just I don't know, any conflict, I guess, right? Like the Ukrainians are learning and the Russians are learning and adapting over time, but how could you then, like when modeling the war in Ukraine, then how could you then adapt it within a game?
Yeah, there's a couple different. There's a couple different ways people have gone at that. One way is to actually have the ability to increase the cohesion or morale or whatever, or effectiveness or whatever variable it is that you're quantifying that within a unit over time, based upon not necessarily the unit's achievement. It gets too fiddly, but a certain number of successes gets you to upgrade a unit or something, and that's not a bad way of doing it. I mean, it's a little kind of crude, but it works. I mean, it's not a bad way of doing it at all. And it still enables you to differentiate between units within a force structure without having all of them kind of clicking up, because that, yeah, one of the things that in the Third World War game was we didn't track casualties at all. We tracked nothing but losses in cohesion, some of which would be associated with casualties. But then, and it was all about, you know, getting the unit out of the line and getting its cohesion back up to snuff. We kind of figured that the equipment was almost secondary to that. What's important is how together the people are doing it. So yeah, that's another way of doing it. But I also, a game I'm working on right now, we're doing a World War II game. We're modeling the Battle of the North Atlantic. And so in that, one of the things we have is technology changes that take place over the course of the thing in ASW warfare. And so your ability to spot, to detect, your ability to avoid ASW attacks if you're the U-boats, you're the surface ASW, aerial AS, all these things kind of are tracked separately, and they just provide modifiers. And those are global. They're not unit by unit. They're kind of a global look at experience and technology. So there's a couple different ways to do it.
Thank you so much, Professor Chadwick. I was a young, I was about 9 years old when I was following, my father was driving a Lada through Hungary. We were following a Russian laundry truck. And I was looking at these Russian soldiers staring back at us. And of course, playing World War III, we had our pile of asterisks that we were, sticking on the units as they lost their cohesion. So, right away I thought of that. What were those soldiers thinking? Lying in the back of the truck on top of that laundry. Perhaps it was a good posting in Hungary. I don't know. It wasn't obviously a very serious front, but it's definitely one of those extreme intangibles. Professor Chadwick, this was not a normal talk. Normally they're 1 hour long, and you spoke for 3 hours. Thank you very much on behalf of the SDS, the Concordia University Simulation, it's Strategic and Diplomatic Society. We use wargaming at Concordia pedagogically. I'm obviously personally very invested and interested as a former staff officer, and thank you very much for sharing your wisdom. And I know how incredibly busy you are. Everyone can see that from the bio that we sent out. I wish you luck, and I wish that you have enough time to complete all of those activities that you're obviously having to deal with over the next weeks, months. So thank you very much.
Nice to see you, Frank.
Nice to see you, Charles. And thanks very much for the invitation. Luke, nice to meet you. Julian, thanks very much. It was a good time. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.